make you lose your mind," the Apache widow said to the lonely rancher who would change her life. The sun was dipping low over the Arizona plains, throwing long golden shadows across the dry, cracked soil. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the faint scent of dust and the faint aroma of distant pine. The ranch at the edge of the small town looked lonely, almost forgotten, with its weathered fences and the main house made of sun-bleached wood standing stubborn against the endless horizon. Inside the house, John Mallory, the rancher, moved quietly, as if every creak of the floorboards might disturb the fragile peace he had built around himself. He was a tall man, with broad shoulders that seemed even broader because of the years he had spent working under the unforgiving sun. His hair was streaked with gray, and lines around his eyes hinted at sleepless nights and a life filled with hard choices. He had been living alone for nearly 10 years, since the day his wife had died in an accident, leaving him with nothing but memories and the endless work of keeping the ranch alive. John was used to silence. He liked it. It let him think, let him breathe, let him keep the grief he carried locked away in a corner of his mind. That was until the day she arrived. She came into town quietly, but there was something about her that made people notice. Her movements were deliberate, confident, and yet there was a weight to her steps that hinted at sorrow she carried inside. She was not young, but not old, and her dark hair framed a face that could have been beautiful if not for the shadow of grief in her eyes. People in town whispered about her, some with curiosity, some with suspicion. She was the widow of an Apache man, whose life had ended suddenly, leaving her alone in a world that seemed ready to judge her for every step she took. The first time John saw her, she was standing near the edge of his property, her hands tucked under her arms as if bracing against the wind. She looked out over the fields as if she had lived there all her life, and there was a sharp intelligence in her eyes that made John instinctively cautious. He had seen many people pass through this town, but few had the strength to stand against the loneliness that seemed to cling to him. "I'll make you lose your mind," she said suddenly, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made John stiffen. He blinked, uncertain if he had heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, stepping closer. The wind tugged at his hat, and the wooden fence groaned as if the land itself were warning him to be careful. "I said I'll make you lose your mind," she repeated, her eyes locking on his with a steady intensity. There was no smile, no hint of joking, just a quiet, unshakable certainty. John frowned. People in town often said strange things, but there was something different about her. Something dangerous, not in a violent way, but in a way that suggested she could challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. "I don't know what you mean," he said cautiously. "This is private property." She stepped closer, unafraid of his height, his presence, or the distance between them. "I don't care about fences or property," she said. "I care about people who hide behind their work, people who think they're safe because they live alone. I'll make you face what you've been running from." Most people would have laughed, walked away, or called her rude, but there was something about her tone that made him pause. It wasn't threatening exactly, it was honest. Painful even. And beneath it he felt a flicker of curiosity he hadn't felt in years. "What do you want?" he asked, keeping his voice even. He didn't like being drawn into conversations he didn't start. "I need work," she said simply. "And maybe a place to stay for a while. I don't know yet. I just know I can do things. I can help." John studied her. His ranch needed help, and he wasn't proud enough to refuse it, even if he didn't want company. He didn't trust her, not yet. But the idea of someone who could take some of the weight off his shoulders was tempting. "You know, most people who come here don't last more than a week," he said finally. "The work is hard. The wind doesn't stop. The sun doesn't care who you are."
"I know," she replied. There was no fear in her voice.
Only quiet acceptance. I'm not most people." Something in him wanted to argue. Something in him wanted to tell her she didn't belong. But he also sensed that if he refused, he might miss something he didn't even understand yet. "Duh. All right," he said at last. "You can work here. But I warn you, I don't have time for complaints or excuses. The land doesn't care about either." She nodded. "I work." And just like that, the fragile truce began. The first days were quiet, tense, and filled with the ordinary rhythm of ranch life. She learned quickly how to feed the animals, mend fences, and handle the stubborn mule that had refused to let anyone near it for months. John watched her carefully, noting her determination and the way she moved as if she belonged there, even though she had just arrived. Despite himself, he found small things about her fascinating, the way she would pause and listen to the wind, as if reading secrets in its howl, the way she would hum quietly to herself while working, not out of cheerfulness, but as a way to keep the loneliness at bay. The townspeople continued to whisper, but John stopped caring. He had spent so long in silence that even the faintest human presence felt both threatening and comforting. One evening, after a long day of work, the widow sat on the porch steps, looking out over the land. The sky was a deep purple, and the first stars began to shine. John joined her quietly, holding a cup of coffee in his hands. Neither spoke for a while. The silence wasn't awkward. It was shared. "You're different from the others," John said finally. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I've had reasons to be," she said softly. "Life doesn't always leave you a choice." He nodded, understanding more than he wanted to admit. They didn't talk about the past, not yet, but the weight of it was there, hanging between them like the scent of the dry earth after a rare rainfall. Days turned into weeks. The widow became part of the rhythm of the ranch, not because she wanted to replace what John had lost, but because she understood the work, the land, and the quiet ache of being alone. And though John didn't say it, he began to look forward to her presence. He began to notice small details. The way she carefully stacked the firewood, the way she always made sure the animals had enough water, the way she would pause to watch the sunset as if seeing it for the first time. But the tension that had accompanied their first meeting never fully disappeared. She had a way of challenging him, of asking questions that made him uncomfortable, of reminding him of emotions he had buried deep. Sometimes he would snap at her, and sometimes she would snap back, sharp and unafraid. And through it all, that first warning echoed in his mind. "I'll make you lose your mind." It was true, in a way he didn't fully understand yet. She was stirring something inside him, something raw and unguarded, and it both frightened and intrigued him. He found himself thinking about her even when he didn't want to. He found himself wondering what she had seen in her life to make her so fearless. And though he would never admit it aloud, he began to hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had believed for all these years. The wind continued to sweep across the plains, carrying dust and whispers and the scent of possibility. And in that quiet, lonely ranch, two lives had collided, both scarred by loss, both hardened by time, and both unaware that their meeting would change everything. The first spark had been lit, and though neither of them knew it yet, the story of the lonely rancher and the Apache widow had only just begun. The morning sun spilled over the horizon, painting the fields in gold and shadow. The ranch, quiet except for the sounds of animals stirring, seemed almost alive in the early light. John was already outside, inspecting the fences, his boots crunching on the dry dirt. He had learned over the years that the land demanded attention before anything else. There was no room for distraction, no time for weakness, and no mercy for mistakes. The widow, whose name was Ayanna, appeared at the edge of the barn. She had already fed the chickens and was brushing down the horses, her movements careful and precise. She noticed John and nodded in acknowledgement, but she didn't approach him too closely. There was a distance they both respected, unspoken but present, like the line between day and night. "You're up early," John said, his voice low. "I sleep best when the wind is quiet," she replied. Her eyes scanned the horizon as if looking for something far beyond the ranch, something neither of them could name. John shook his head, not sure why he felt compelled to say anything more. Most people would have simply nodded and gone about their tasks, but Ayanna was not most people, and he had learned that in the first few weeks she had been on the ranch. She challenged him in ways he wasn't used to, forcing him to think, to feel, to question the walls he had built around himself. The day began like any other, with chores stacked one after another. John repaired a section of fence that had broken during a storm the previous week, while Ayanna gathered firewood and checked the water troughs. The work was hard and exhausting, but there was a rhythm to it, a silent understanding that they were building something together even if neither wanted to say it aloud. "You missed a spot," John said suddenly, pointing to a section of the fence. Ayanna turned to look, her brow furrowed. "I thought that was secure," she said, moving closer to inspect it. "Maybe I was wrong." John studied her for a moment. He could have scolded her, could have insisted on doing it himself, but instead he nodded. "We'll fix it together," he said. It was the first time he had said something like that to another person in years, and the words felt strange, but as they worked side by side, something shifted between them. The tension of their first meeting began to ease, replaced by a cautious respect. They didn't need to speak much. The land, the animals, and the chores created a rhythm that connected them in ways words could not. Yet, every now and then, a glance or a small gesture revealed layers of personality and history neither wanted to share too soon. By mid-afternoon the sun had climbed high, and the heat pressed down on the land. They'd paused under the shade of a lone mesquite tree, catching their breath and wiping sweat from their faces. Ayanna pulled a small cloth from her pocket and dabbed at a cut on her hand. John watched her carefully, surprised at how quickly he felt concerned for her well-being. "You're careful," he said finally. "Most people would have ignored that." Ayanna looked at him and gave a small smile. "I've learned to notice things," she said simply. "Life doesn't give second chances easily." The words hung in the air between them, and John found himself thinking about their meaning. He knew all too well that life could be unforgiving, that every choice carried consequences, and that grief had a way of shaping people in ways outsiders rarely understood. Ayanna carried that same weight, but unlike him, she faced it with a quiet strength that was both inspiring and unsettling. The evening brought another chore, feeding the cattle. The sun was low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As they walked along the pasture, Ayanna kept pace with John, matching his stride without effort. They moved in silence at first, letting the sounds of the cattle and the distant call of birds fill the space. Then, almost without warning, she spoke. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" John paused, his hand on the fence post. He didn't answer immediately, unsure if he should. Most people who asked such questions were looking for an excuse to judge, to criticize, or to push him out of his comfort zone. But Ayanna wasn't like that. She asked not to provoke, but to understand. "I don't," he said finally. "This is my life, my work, my responsibility." She nodded as if she had expected that answer. "And yet, you're alone." Her words were simple, but they struck him deeply. He had spent so many years hiding behind work and routine that he hadn't considered how loneliness had shaped him, how it had held him back from connecting with anyone. Ayanna saw it clearly, and the realization was uncomfortable. "Maybe," he said, after a long pause, "but I'm used to it." "Used to it doesn't make it right," she said softly. "Sometimes we get so used to being alone that we forget we're alive." He looked at her, noticing the earnestness in her eyes, and something inside him stirred. She wasn't asking for anything from him, not really. She was offering him a choice he hadn't realized he had. And for the first time in a long while, he considered it. Over the next few days, their routines became more intertwined. They shared meals on the porch, sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation. Ayanna had a way of asking questions that made John think about things he had buried long ago, his fears, his regrets, his hopes. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to respond. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains, Ayanna brought out a small sketchbook. She had been drawing the ranch, the animals, and the landscape, capturing details that even John had overlooked. He watched as her hand moved with precision, creating scenes that felt alive and full of emotion. "You have a gift?" he said quietly, unable to hide his admiration. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "It's just a way to remember things," she said. "A way to see beauty in places others might miss." For so long he had been focused on survival, on maintaining the ranch, on keeping the world at a distance. He had never thought about beauty or memory or small moments of joy. But sitting there, watching her draw, he realized that perhaps there was more to life than work and solitude. Their bond grew slowly, built on shared labor, quiet observation, and the occasional spark of challenge. They argued sometimes, of course, about chores, about methods, about things that seemed insignificant in the larger world. But even in disagreement, there was a sense of respect, a recognition that each had survived struggles that the other could barely imagine. Ayanna had a way of pushing boundaries without force. She asked questions that demanded honesty, made suggestions that required him to consider new possibilities, and refused to accept excuses. And though it frustrated him at times, John found himself learning from her, thinking in ways he hadn't for years. One afternoon, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Dark clouds gathered over the plains, and the wind picked up with a sudden intensity. John and Ayanna rushed to secure the animals, bringing the cattle into the barn and ensuring that the horses were safely tied. The rain began to fall, first in scattered drops, then in a steady downpour that turned the dirt into thick, sticky mud. They worked side by side, moving quickly, shouting over the sound of the wind. In the chaos, there was no room for hesitation, no time for fear. They relied on each other completely, their movements synchronized by necessity. And when the last animal was safe, they stood in the doorway of the barn, drenched and exhausted, laughing at the absurdity of the situation. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. The storm had tested them, shown them their strengths and weaknesses, and revealed the trust that had been growing quietly over weeks. Neither spoke of it directly, but both felt it, and it deepened their connection in ways words could not capture. As the rain continued to fall outside, they sat together on a bale of hay, sharing a warm meal that Ayana had prepared quickly before the storm. They talked quietly about small things, memories from childhood, favorite foods, the simple joys they had discovered in unexpected places, and in that conversation, John realized that he was beginning to see the world differently, through the eyes of someone who had known loss and had chosen not to let it harden her completely. By the time the storm passed, the ranch was transformed. The air smelled fresh, the fields gleamed with moisture, and the sunset painted the sky with colors that seemed almost impossible. John and Ayana stood together, looking out over the land, feeling a sense of renewal that neither had expected. The days continued in this rhythm: work, shared meals, quiet reflection, and small meaningful conversations. They grew to rely on each other in subtle ways, sometimes for help, sometimes for companionship, sometimes simply for the comfort of knowing that someone else was there. And with each passing day, the tension of their first meeting began to fade, replaced by a deepening bond built on trust, respect, and mutual understanding. John began to realize that Ayana had, in her own way, begun to change him. She had challenged him, provoked him, and inspired him to confront the emotions he had long ignored. And though he would never admit it aloud, he found himself looking forward to each day, anticipating her presence, and valuing the life they were building together. Ayana, too, felt the shift. The rancher, once distant and unyielding, had begun to open up, showing glimpses of the man beneath the hard exterior. She had seen his strength, his resilience, and the depth of his grief, and she had come to respect and even care for him. For both of them, the journey was just beginning, and though neither knew what the future held, they were no longer alone, and so life at the ranch continued, shaped by labor, weather, and the quiet, steady growth of a bond that neither had expected but both had come to need. In the vast open plains of Arizona, two wounded souls had found each other, and though challenges remained, there was now hope, connection, and the first hints of a life that might finally be shared. The summer days on the ranch were long and hot, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and the earth smell of dry dust and life. John had grown used to the rhythm of the land, but with Ayana there, each day seemed brighter, more alive. She moved through the chores with an ease and confidence that made him admire her silently, though he rarely admitted it. Their mornings began early, as always. The sun would barely peek over the horizon when they were already at work. They fed the animals, repaired fences, and prepared the fields for planting. Despite the constant work, there was a new lightness to the ranch, as if the land itself sensed the quiet change in its caretakers. One morning as they worked side by side, Ayana paused and looked out over the fields. "Have you ever thought about planting something different?" she asked. John raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Something that grows slower. Something that lasts beyond us." Her eyes were thoughtful, scanning the horizon. "We take care of the land, but what if we also leave something behind?" John considered it. He had been tending the ranch for decades, keeping it alive, but never thinking beyond the day-to-day survival. "Maybe," he said slowly. "Maybe it's time to try." And so together they planned a small patch of the field for a new crop. It was an experiment, a risk, but one that filled John with a quiet excitement he hadn't felt in years. Ayana's presence made him see possibilities beyond routine, beyond the loneliness he had once accepted as normal. As the weeks passed, the bond between them deepened. They shared small routines, coffee before the sun rose, quiet conversations on the porch at night, laughter over small mistakes in the barn. John noticed that he was thinking about her even when she wasn't around, wondering what she would say or how she would respond. Ayana, too, seemed more at ease, her gaze softer when she looked at him, her steps lighter as she moved through the ranch. But life on the ranch was never without its challenges. One afternoon, dark clouds gathered quickly over the plains. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the faint electricity of a storm. John and Ayana were in the fields finishing up a row of crops when the first drops fell. "We need to get inside!" John shouted over the wind. Ayana nodded, but as they ran toward the barn, a sudden flash of lightning struck near the fence. The sound of the thunder was deafening, and one of the horses bolted in fright. John's heart raced as he ran after it, calling its name. Ayana followed, keeping her voice steady, guiding the frightened animal back toward safety. The storm hit with full force, rain lashing against the roof of the barn, wind tearing at the wooden walls. Inside, the animals were restless, and the two of them worked tirelessly to calm them. Mud and water soaked their clothes, and exhaustion settled into their muscles, but neither stopped. They were in this together, relying on each other completely. When the last animal was secured, they leaned against the barn wall, panting and dripping wet. John looked at Ayanna, seeing not just the strength she had shown, but the courage and calmness that had guided him through the chaos. "You were incredible," he said quietly. Ayanna smiled, though it was tired. "We were incredible," she said, "together." For the first time, John allowed himself to feel a deep sense of gratitude and connection. He realized that she had changed him, made him see that he could trust, rely on, and care for someone again. And he saw in her eyes a reflection of the same realization. She was no longer alone, either. The storm passed by evening, leaving the fields glistening with water and the air fresh and clean. They spent the night repairing minor damage to the barn and checking the fences. As they worked, their conversations became more personal, more honest. They shared memories of their pasts, of love lost and hardships endured, of the moments that had shaped them into who they were. Ayanna spoke of her late husband, of the life they had planned together, and the suddenness of his passing. She spoke without bitterness, only with a quiet sadness that revealed her strength. John listened, feeling a pang of empathy and understanding he hadn't allowed himself in years. "I lost someone too," he admitted finally. "My wife? It's been hard to live without her." She reached out, briefly touching his arm. "Grief doesn't leave us," she said softly. "It changes us, but it doesn't have to define us forever." Her words struck him. He had spent so long in silence, thinking that remembering meant reliving the pain. But Ayanna's presence showed him that memory could be a source of strength, that grief could be shared and softened by trust. Over the next few days, they worked on strengthening not just the land, but their connection. They repaired fences, planted crops, and shared small joys, watching a foal take its first steps, tasting the first fruits of their newly planted field, or laughing at the mule's stubborn antics. Each moment reinforced the bond between them, creating a foundation of trust and understanding. One evening, after a long day, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was ablaze with orange and pink, the air cool and calm. John poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Ayanna. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked, her voice quiet. John considered it. For years he had only thought about surviving the next day, keeping the ranch running, and avoiding the loneliness that pressed on him. "I try not to," he admitted, "but lately I've started to wonder if there's more." Ayanna looked at him with a soft smile. "There is. You just have to be willing to see it." He watched her, realizing that she had become more than just a helper, more than just a companion on the ranch. She had become someone who challenged him, inspired him, and made him feel alive again. And though the thought scared him, it also filled him with hope. The turning point came unexpectedly. One morning as they were checking the irrigation system, John slipped on a muddy slope and injured his ankle. He tried to hide the pain, but Ayanna was quick to notice. "You're hurt," she said firmly, kneeling beside him. "Let me help." John protested, not wanting to appear weak, but she ignored him. Carefully, she examined the ankle, noting the swelling. "You need to rest," she said. "I'll take care of the chores today." For the first time, John let himself be vulnerable. He allowed her to lead, to make decisions, to take charge, and as she moved through the ranch with skill and confidence, he realized how much he had relied on her, not just for physical help, but for emotional support as well. The days that followed were slow, but John had to stay off his feet, which gave him time to observe Ayanna in action. He saw her patience, her intelligence, and the quiet strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. And as he rested, he found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed since she had arrived. The rancher who had once been distant and reserved now spoke more freely, shared small thoughts and feelings, and allowed himself to be guided in ways he had resisted before. She felt a growing affection for him, a sense that together they could face any challenge the land or life might throw at them. By the time John's ankle healed, the bond between them had grown stronger than either had anticipated. They had faced the storm together, shared their pasts, confronted fears, and learned to trust one another fully. The ranch itself seemed to reflect the change, thriving under their combined care, full of life and possibility. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, John and Ayanna walked through the fields, side by side. They didn't speak much, but the silence was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding and mutual respect. They had faced challenges together and had come through stronger, wiser, and more connected. John looked at Ayanna, noticing the way her hair caught the light, the softness of her expression, and the determination that had never left her. He felt a warmth in his chest, a mixture of admiration, gratitude, and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. Ayanna glanced at him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. She didn't speak, but the look she gave him said everything. She had changed his life in ways he hadn't imagined, made him see possibilities beyond routine and grief, and shown him the strength of trust and connection. And in that moment, both of them knew that their lives had been forever altered, not by words alone, but by shared experiences, challenges faced together, and the courage to open their hearts to one another. The land stretched out before them, vast and endless, but for the first time, neither felt alone. Together, they had faced storms, both literal and emotional, and had emerged stronger, connected, and ready for whatever lay ahead. The story of the lonely rancher and the Apache widow had reached a turning point. Transformation had begun, trust had been earned, and hope had taken root. And though they did not know what the future held, they were certain of one thing. Together, they could face it. The first frost of autumn had begun to touch the plains, giving the early mornings a sharp, clean feeling. The ranch was quiet as the sun rose, and John found himself awake earlier than usual. For the first time in years, he didn't wake with a weight of loneliness pressing down on him. Instead, he felt a quiet anticipation, a sense that life was moving forward in ways he had not dared to imagine. Ayanna was already up, tending to the animals. Her hands moved with practiced skill, and she greeted him with a small smile as he stepped outside. There was an ease between them now, a familiarity that had grown from weeks of shared work, storms weathered, and quiet conversations under the wide sky. "Morning," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that made the cold morning feel gentle. "Morning, John," replied, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. For the first time he noticed the colors of the sunrise, the glint of frost on the grass, and the soft sound of the wind moving through the trees. Life had taken on a richness he had long forgotten. Their days now had a steady rhythm, but it was different from before. Chores were done with laughter, stories were shared over breakfast, and the work of the ranch felt lighter with two people carrying the burden together. John found himself noticing the little things about Ayanna. The way she brushed hay from her hair, the small gestures of care she extended to the animals, and the way she always paused to watch the horizon, as if listening to the land itself. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of the fence along the eastern pasture, John paused to rest, wiping sweat from his brow. "You've changed this place," he said quietly. Ayanna looked at him, tilting her head. "No, we've changed it together," she replied. "And maybe we've changed each other too." John smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. It was true. He had been alone for so long, weighed down by grief and routine, but Ayanna had shown him something different: hope, companionship, and the possibility of joy. He realized that he was no longer the same man who had greeted her with suspicion and distance weeks ago. As the days grew colder, they prepared the ranch for winter. Firewood was stacked high, the barns were secured, and the animals were well fed and sheltered. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, drinking tea and talking quietly about the days ahead, their voices mingling with the soft crackle of flames. One evening, John found himself telling Ayanna about his dreams, things he had never shared with anyone. He spoke of the life he had imagined with his wife, the places he had hoped to see, and the small, simple joys he had long forgotten. She listened, her eyes soft, offering no judgment, only understanding. "You've carried a lot," she said finally, her hand brushing lightly against his. "But you're not carrying it alone anymore." The words struck him deeply. He realized that he had been holding himself back, afraid to let anyone in, afraid to risk being hurt again. But Ayanna had shown him that trust could be earned, that love could be gentle, and that life could be shared without losing oneself. As winter approached, they worked on a new project together, a small orchard near the edge of the fields. They planted apple trees, careful and deliberate, knowing that their work would take time to bear fruit. The act of planting something new, something that would grow and flourish beyond them, filled both of them with hope. It was a symbol of renewal, of life moving forward, and of the bond that had formed between them. One particularly cold morning, Ayanna found a small bird caught in the frost. Its tiny body shivered, and its wings were weak. Without hesitation, she scooped it up, cradling it in her hands. John watched, feeling a deep sense of admiration. She cared not only for the land and the animals, but for life itself, and he realized how much he had come to value her presence. "We'll keep it warm," she said softly. "It'll be all right." Together, they built a small shelter for the bird, offering warmth and protection. And in that simple act, John understood the depth of Ayanna's compassion, and how it had quietly changed him as well. He felt a connection not just to her, but to the world around him, a connection that had been absent for far too long. The weeks turned into months, and the ranch thrived under their care. The orchard took root, the fields were healthy, and the animals were strong. More importantly, John and Ayana's bond had deepened into something steady and enduring. They had faced storms, shared grief, celebrated small victories, and learned to trust one another completely. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, John and Ayana stood together at the edge of the orchard. The air was crisp, and the world seemed quiet and full of promise. "I never thought life could feel like this again," John said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Ayana looked at him, her gaze steady and soft. "Neither did I," she admitted, "but here we are." They stood in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of the past and the hope of the future. And then, without words, they turned to each other, the connection between them undeniable. They had both been changed, healed in ways they had not expected, strengthened by shared experience, and ready to face whatever came next. As winter settled in, the ranch became a place of warmth and life. The animals were cared for, the fields rested under a blanket of frost, and the orchard promised fruit in the seasons to come. John and Ayana continued their routines, but now there was laughter, conversation, and a shared sense of purpose. The loneliness that had once defined John's life was gone, replaced by companionship, trust, and quiet joy. The townspeople began to notice the change as well. Whispers of admiration replaced the old rumors and suspicion. They saw the two of them working together, thriving together, and realized that something real and lasting had grown between the lonely rancher and the Apache widow. One afternoon, as snow began to fall lightly over the plains, John and Ayana sat by the fire, sipping tea. The warmth of the flames mirrored the warmth in their hearts, a testament to the journey they had shared. They spoke of plans for the coming year, of the orchard, the fields, and the life they wanted to build together. "I never thought I'd find this," John said softly, looking at her. "Someone who understands me, challenges me, and cares for me." Ayana smiled, her eyes shining. "And I never thought I'd find someone I could trust completely, someone who could be my partner in life." In that moment, the past seemed distant, the grief and loss softened by the bond they had formed. They had faced storms, hardships, and the loneliness of life alone, and yet here they were, stronger, happier, and ready for a future shared together. As the snow fell outside, covering the ranch in a soft white blanket, John and Ayana felt a sense of peace that had been missing from their lives for far too long. They had found each other, healed each other, and discovered that life, even after loss, could still be beautiful. The ranch, once a place of solitude and hard labor, had become a home filled with warmth, trust, and hope. John and Ayana had built something lasting, not just in the land they cared for, but in the lives they shared. They had learned that love could be gentle, that trust could be earned, and that even the loneliest hearts could find connection. And so, as the winter settled over the plains and the first stars appeared in the clear night sky, they stood together on the porch, hands intertwined, hearts open, and lives forever changed. The lonely rancher and the Apache widow had found not only each other, but a new beginning, a shared future, and the quiet joy of being truly understood. The story of their lives was no longer one of loss and solitude. It was a story of resilience, of trust, of transformation, and of love that had grown slowly, quietly, and beautifully. And as they looked out over the land they had nurtured together, they knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them side by side, stronger for the journey they had shared. For John and Ayana, life had come full circle. From loneliness and grief, they had moved to hope and companionship. From caution and mistrust, they had found connection and trust. And in the heart of the vast open plains, they had discovered something precious, a life worth living, together.